For modern audiences reading Charles Dickens, it may be easy to believe he overplayed the tragic backgrounds of many of the children in his novels. I certainly never imagined that Dickens actually sanitized what he and others went through to keep it suitable for publishing. But the brutality, perversity, and systemic violence done to Victorian British children is almost beyond comprehension. In our lesson today, we will start off with some of the lesser, though still horrible, real life accounts that inspired Dickens. But, and I'll put a content warning before we get there, it eventually gets nauseating. After today, whenever you watch A Christmas Carol and the people collecting charity for the poor remark of the workhouses,
Many cannot go there.
And many would rather die.
you will understand that it was neither added by the author for dramatic effect, nor was it hyperbole by those who said it. With that said, the history is worth telling. It is worth telling for the victims who never escaped. It is worth telling for the inspirational ones who did. It is worth telling lest we forget what humanity is capable of in its darkest depths, and what it will willingly stoop to, barefaced, no concealment, out of greed and perverse pleasure. So, let's take a look at the real children who inspired Charles Dickens. Dickens' own childhood, specifically about 1 year of it, was what first awakened him to the living nightmare that many of his peers lived for their entire childhood. It was a reality that Dickens was very aware that he should not have ever needed to experience. His father, John, made a decent, middle-class income as a pay clerk for the Royal Navy. In his final year, he made around 440 pounds, which in modern terms is around 65,000 US dollars. This would mean that in modern times, in a 40-hour work week, he was making the equivalent of around $30 an hour. But John was not content being middle class. He wanted to be a gentleman. During my research, I became convinced that Pip's whininess and entitlement in Great Expectations is actually based on John Dickens, not Charles. He's so overspent on hosting lavish parties, fine clothes, and other luxuries so that he ended up in a debtor's prison and refused to even work there, believing it beneath him. Charles Dickens, the oldest male child at age 11, was sent to work at a shoe polish factory. Once there, he worked for 60 hours a week for a mere 6 shillings. The average adult skilled labor at the time made 15 for about 50 hours of work. 6 shillings today amounts to a little bit above $60. So in modern times, this would be someone working for only $1 an hour. And of course, that was before expenses. While the rest of his family lived together in the debtor's prison housing, Charles had to live in the factory housing. And while we don't know for sure in this case, the overwhelming majority of the time, room and board would be deducted from the wage before pay. In which case, it's likely he only made 3 shillings per week, so about 50 cents an hour in modern times. And he never even saw that much. As a minor, it would have been sent straight to his parents in the debtor's prison, where it would have barely provided for the food that they needed. And the conditions were deplorable. Dickens would later recount the nauseating chemicals he had to inhale every day, as well as the rotten floorboards and a perpetual rat infestation. For a little more than a year, Charles Dickens, born to a middle-class English family, became a child slave. Even so, he had it relatively easy compared to many children. His chief physical dangers lay in the polish itself, which was composed of hazardous chemicals, and rat-borne diseases from his furry, filthy roommates. He was not near any dangerous machinery that crushed to death or maimed for life untold numbers of children, and his young body would not become deformed as he grew through unnaturally heavy burdens and contortions. But the thing most injured was his psyche. A boy with a strong imagination and intellect who dreamed of a life with purpose felt all the promise of his life slipping away. As weeks turned into months, and months passed into a year, he felt the only thing he would ever do in life was the mind-numbing task of pasting labels for 60 to 80 hours a week. Slowly, he began to understand why, when faced with such a life, the desire to escape the meaningless existence so often drove people to either crime or self-harm. His life, as he currently knew it, would never bring him pleasure, nor would he experience the joy of helping others. Paste, stick. Paste, stick. Bell for bed. Listen to the rats and the rotten floors as he drifted into a semi-unconscious sleep. Wake to the bell and rat sounds again. Paste, stick, repeat. This singular year would change the course of his life forever, as well as the whole of England, as it led to his stories telling the plight of the most vulnerable in the country, fighting the only way he knew how, through story. The novels that were most inspired by this year in his life were Little Dorrit, where the life of a debtor's prison inmate and his family are explored in detail, and David Copperfield, where the titular character also works in a factory and describes it much the same way Charles Dickens would in his letters, Indeed, before Dickens had the strength to confess to all the things that he went through personally, David Copperfield served as his mouthpiece. Other stories were influenced to a lesser extent. In Great Expectations, Pip's mournful loss of his parents seems to come from this year in Dickens' own life, thinking he may never see them again, while the whiny, entitled nature seems largely inspired by his father. Charles escaped after a year of servitude because of the death of his paternal grandmother, who left a small inheritance of about 1 year of John's salary, enough to pay his debts. Unfortunately, he would not learn his lesson. The family was so desperate they considered keeping Charles in the factory, and even sending him back after they fetched him. This act of betrayal would be something he never fully forgave, with him warning them at the age of 13 that if they tried, not only would he not go, but he would disappear and they would never see him again. This, in part, contributed to so many orphans starring in his works. Charles felt a kinship with them not because he lost his parents, but because they were willing to lose him. In Charles' mind, he lost the comfort of loving parents at the age of 11. But though Charles only spent a year as a child slave, he learned of many that were worse off than him, and he never forgot it. Instead, he investigated to learn all he could. I just spoke of how his parents almost sent him back to earn just a pittance through his misery. Some parents did do this, but even more common were people who defrauded parents, promising to care for their children only to pocket it and barely keep the children alive. This was the practice of many boarding school headmasters, especially in Yorkshire, as portrayed in the novel Nicholas Nickleby. As an adult, having heard of the abuses of Yorkshire schools, Dickens went undercover as an investigative journalist. One of the places that he investigated was Bowes Academy after seeing an ad, which he almost copied word for word in Nicholas Nickleby for its fictional counterpart, Dotheboys Hall. Dickens had to mask his horror as he witnessed half-starved children, the money sent by their parents for their welfare, instead being used by the headmaster for his own personal enjoyment. He would beat the children mercilessly whenever they would dare to complain or for any minor offenses, and force them to write letters home while he watched, talking about how good things were. Whenever a parent or official would come, the children would be dressed up for a show, with headmasters offering one excuse or another to explain the sickly appearance. He would sneakily interview students whenever he got the opportunity. The result of these investigations were the amalgamation characters Mr. Squeers, the headmaster, and Smike, the tragic orphan, in Nicholas Nickleby. Upon publishing, the outrage of the treatment his audience read, from the beatings to the starving and sleeping 4 children to a bed with so little cover and clothing that they almost continually stayed sick, led to a public outcry. But the most motivating and influential inspiration was a non-fictional biographical piece, a memoir of Robert Blincoe. Content warning. I will not go into nearly as much or vivid detail, though if you want to fully know the horrors Robert and his peers endured, you can read it for yourself free from the Gutenberg Project. I will provide a link in the description. If you need, take a break, or even leave the video unfinished. But after this, you will have no doubt that I was not being hyperbolic earlier when calling this slavery, as what was written in this memoir read like something from the transatlantic slave trade. I had never heard of any people so brutally and systemically abusing their own children. Now, let's get this over with. The memoir, though not written by Dickens, was certainly read by him. It was published when he was 20 years old and widely distributed, raising public outcry. Robert Blincoe, like many of Dickens' characters, was an orphan. Robert spent his nursery years in the workhouse at St. Pancras, an area on the outskirts of London. But it wasn't just orphans that ended up in the workhouses. Due to the poor laws, many children from destitute families were taken from their homes and placed in them. When the child became 7, or could pass for 7, they were lined up for a physical inspection for the worst employers that couldn't find willing apprentices. Chimney sweeps, which Disney did a great disservice with the plucky Dick Van Dyke, cotton mills, coal mines, the places no one ever wanted to go. The children would slink away and try to make themselves look as small and weak as possible to avoid being chosen. And if chosen, they could not refuse, nor could their parents. Sometimes the parents were not even notified. One girl, whose story was used as corroboration by the compiler, John Doherty, found out her mother had tried to visit her in the workhouse, only to be told that her daughter had been apprenticed and was no longer her concern. She would later go mad and die in an asylum. Once apprenticed, these children would work a minimum of 12 hours a day, though in fact it was normally 14 to 16. Their pay was almost nothing, and they rarely saw what little they did make. Whenever they did not meet their quotas, they made a mistake, or were simply moving too slowly, they were beaten. Most of their meals consisted of gruel. If lucky, a bit of oat bread. The first meal Robert worked at, he lost a finger and was sent back to work within an hour once the surgeon had made sure it was impossible for it to keep bleeding. He watched with horror as a girl was caught by her apron and pulled into the machinery, being crushed and rolled over again and again until the machine got stuck on one of her bones. She miraculously survived, but was horrifically maimed for life, and she still had to work the same hours as everyone else, but she could no longer keep up with the same quota and became an assistant to her more able-bodied peers. But most terrifying of all, this was the least evil place that they worked. The beatings were cruel, but not out of sadism. They were used to maximize productivity and profit. The work was hard, but unless there was an accident, it did not cause deformities simply in its nature. When sick, they were given access to a doctor, who most often prescribed bed rest and good nutrition, which were given. But though the doctor would plead with the owner that the children's illnesses would almost become non-existent if allowed adequate rest and nutrition continually instead of only when sick, the cost was deemed too much. And if a child ever tried to run away, they were almost immediately captured and promptly brought back by cruel men who would return them for more money in the brief time it took to march them back than the child made in 80 hours of hard labor. Everything I just described took place at Loudon Mill, but they did at least follow what few laws there were, which put them above most of the mills. Following the laws would also be its downfall, as many did not. And when laws were passed that limited the amount of hours, Loudon Mill followed them, but Lytton Mill and many others did not. Loudon Mill had to close its doors and send its apprentices to Lytton Mill, and in Lytton Mill, the nightmare really began. The children began to work a minimum of 16 hours a day, under loads so heavy that they would all become deformed. But worst of all, the owner and most of his adult employers were former child apprentices themselves, and instead of having pity, had given themselves over to sadism, torturing their own apprentices to release their hate. I won't go into all the horrors they endured. The video would more than double in length and make most people sick, but I will give 2 examples. One time, Robert was tied by his wrist onto a roof beam with his feet off the floor, next to a gear that, by pulling himself up, he could avoid being hit on the shins. This he did, until of course exhaustion made it impossible. His shins were hit incredibly hard over and over again until his sadistic taskmaster got bored of the screams. The girls were not spared either. The author describes them trying to stifle their cries after suffering indecent treatment, which, for any familiar with Victorian sensitivities, was very much a code word. The new mill also refused medical care, and many died from disease or starvation. Others, especially the girls, would escape the world altogether to escape their tormentors. Bear in mind, this was an age and time that people believed doing this would send your soul straight to hell. That is how desperate these people were. Unless you think the memoir was exaggerating, its editor independently verified the accounts through multiple witnesses and left their names and addresses for authorities and anyone else at the time who wanted to verify what he had written. But, though not described in a memoir of Robert Blincoe, some children did escape and turn to a life of thievery, as described in Dickens' Oliver Twist. The reason was quite obvious. Not only did thieving itself pose a much easier life, but so long as they did not commit violence, even being caught was an improvement to the apprenticeship. Ending up in prison was universally an improvement, but even being sent to a penal colony was typically, as demonstrated by Magwitch from Great Expectations, though there were some penal colonies that were just as sadistic. From all this, we can now see that Dickens' novels helped spur the public consciousness and conscience, leading to more journalistic and legal investigations that, over time, ended the cruel childhood slavery that was misleadingly classified as a 14-year apprenticeship. So the next time you find yourself enjoying A Christmas Carol, the Oliver musical, or any of Dickens' novels, remember that as enjoyable as Dickens made his work to be, he was motivated by so much more than entertaining his audience. He was working to inform them, and fight for the children that he knew personally who had come to inspire him. That's it for class today. Until next time, Memento Mori.